In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So today we have one of my more favorite saints, Saint Veronica Giuliani. She's not very well known, but she has a fantastic story, and I think gives a good example of how somebody can become a saint while still having flaws or faults. And also, how do you know somebody who's a saint as opposed to somebody who just looks like a saint? So anyways, there's a lot to cover. I'm going to try to get through this all quickly. No, not quickly. Not in a long manner. Anyways, St. Veronica Giuliani. She was born in Mercatello, Italy on December 27, 1660. She would become a victim soul and a stigmatist, but her birth name was Ursula. Little Ursula means little bear, and she had a love for the poor as a young girl, and as early as 3 years old, she was setting aside some of her own food to give away to poor children. And she had an excellent example from her mother. Her mother died when she was only 7, but as her mother lay dying, she called all of her daughters to her and consecrated each one of her daughters. She had 5 daughters. She consecrated each one of them to one of the wounds of our Lord. So a tremendous example of a very pious woman. Now, little Ursula, who would become Saint Veronica, her mother entrusted Ursula to the wound in the side of Christ. And she said, I leave you in the heart of God, where you will find not only protection, but also learn what it is to love. Again, this is the kind of things that should be happening in a Catholic society. It's just something that people do, right? A dying mother leaving her 5 daughters to the 5 wounds. I mean, what an example of piety. What an excellent example of what can happen in a truly Catholic society. In any case, little Ursula took that to heart, and she would see Christ crucified in everyone, and especially the poor. As mentioned, she was already at 3 years old, setting aside some of her food to give to them. She once met an old beggar in dire need of charity, and with barely anything to offer him, she gave him her favorite pair of shoes. I have no idea how her shoes would fit an old man, but it was that zeal, that love that inspired her to do so. And years later, when she was no longer Ursula, but when she was Veronica, she noted in her diary, "This poor man seemed more beautiful to me than any other living being I had seen." And that would be explained because a little bit later, when she was praying, Christ appeared to her and gave her a pair of golden shoes and said, "These are the shoes you gave me when you were a child. I was that poor beggar." So kind of a proof of that mystical experiences all throughout her life. She came to understand the beauty of giving everything to Christ and would say in her diary when she was a younger girl, "My Lord, what a joy it would be for me to receive the blessing of dying crucified with you in holy martyrdom as so many saints." So a wonderful kind of beginning of her life here, not Veronica yet, but Ursula. However, while these are all wonderful stories and an excellent start to her life and a life of sanctity, this is not sanctity just yet. And here's the proof of it. This is so important for us to see that saints don't, even when they have these excellent episodes or stories of giving her shoes to the beggar, setting aside food for her poor, Lord, it would be wonderful just to be crucified with you. That's not sanctity just yet, not the perfection of sanctity. Because at the age of 16, she had a vision of Christ, and he showed her her heart. Remember, she had her mother had consecrated her to the side of Christ and said, "You're going to know what it is to love." Christ showed her a vision of her heart, and she saw her heart made of steel. She was hard-hearted. How is that possible? She had become a Jansenist. She had become a rigorist. Yes, she had this great love of Christ. She had this great zeal for Christ, but it was still too much of her own natural temperament wrapped up into it. And that is what can happen. Some people naturally they have a natural understanding or desire to do something, to see a poor person and to help them, to be zealous, but it comes from a natural motive. And that's not sanctity, that's just a natural ability. And she realized that she reflected upon this and realized that it was true. She was very hard on other people whom she thought should be doing more. You're not doing enough for God. You don't love God because you're not doing as much as I'm doing. You don't love God because you're not doing what I would do. And so there was this constant subconscious, even she didn't even realize she was doing this, consistently comparing other people to herself. And it wasn't to God, she was comparing them to herself. You're not as zealous as me, you're not as good as me, you don't say as many prayers as I do, you should be doing more. It was very hard. And she saw that great mercy of God to show her heart as a heart of steel. And so that should make us realize that our own temperament can get in the way of sanctity. And every temperament has a different kind of what do they call that? A predominant fault. Something to where you're blind to it and you have a natural ability, but it's not sanctity. So for some people, it's this pride. It's this pride of like zealous activity for Christ. That's not sanctity. For others, it might be deep prayer and like spending long hours in prayer, but it could be self-absorbed. They're thinking too much about themselves, or they're comparing themselves to others. Other people, it might be action. I went out and I did stuff. I started the soup kitchen. I started this. I wrote all kinds of things for Christ. It's action, and it's not really motivated by Christ. So anyways, there's all kinds of pitfalls that we have to be careful for in the spiritual life. And just because we have this great zeal and I want to do something for Christ doesn't mean we actually are doing things for Christ. It might be just my own temperament wanting to do stuff. Anyways, so Ursula had that wonderful vision that Christ gave to her, and it chastened her, and she took it to heart, and was a little bit less hard on other people, and was a little bit less hard on herself. Too often, we are motivating ourselves to accomplish something because we don't want to disappoint ourselves. We have a vision of what we should be, and we want to reach it. And when we don't reach it, we disappoint ourselves. We're not disappointing God. It's us we're disappointing, and that can also get in the way. In any case, Ursula entered a cloistered monastery of the Capuchin Poor Clares, and she took the name there of Sister Veronica. And at the conclusion of the ceremony of her reception, the bishop said to the abbess, "I commend this new daughter to your special care, for she will one day be a great saint." So, what does that say about the bishop to be able to notice that? Now, the proof of Veronica's sanctity was not in her fastings and austerities and prayers, etc., and so on, as we've seen, but she took that admonition of Christ that she had a heart of steel, and she realized that was pride, and the best way to overcome pride is to do, rather than what you want, do what somebody else wants. And religious take vows of obedience, and the proof of Veronica's sanctity was her absolute submission to the will of her superiors and her spiritual directors. That can be very, very difficult, especially if you think that you know better than them, or they're not telling you to do the right thing, or this is a very holy thing that I want to do, and how come you're not letting me do it? Right? No, she put all of that aside and said, okay, I'm going to take the will of my spiritual directors, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's very hard. It's a very hard thing. In fact, they say that of the 3 vows religious take, poverty, chastity, and obedience is the hardest one because it's constantly being exercised. So she did. She took that as entering the convent. She followed the will of her superiors. She put her own will aside, and that is how she arrived at those heights of sanctity. And even when you have a bad superior, even when a superior who is telling you to do something that is less perfect, that can be the will of God also, that you endure and have to go through a hard circumstance. Even though you saw that this is not the right thing to do, you go through it. God can still be giving us lessons from that. But she persevered, and her novitiate was filled with extraordinary interior trials and temptations to return to the world. Right? It was difficult, but she did persevere. I'm going to have to skip some things here. There's some visions she had, etc. But she would write a diary. And I think the spiritual diary she wrote is 22,000 pages long. So quite a number of visions she had of Christ and so on. And here's one that she had of Christ. She had a vision of him wearing a crown of thorns, and this was after 17 years in the convent, so equal to her life in the world. She saw a vision of Christ with a crown of thorns, and she was so overwhelmed with sorrow, she wrote in her diary, "I understood his infinite love and felt my own ingratitude. My Lord," she said, "grant me this crown so that the punctures of its thorns may become voices enabling me to tell you how much I want to love you." And it wasn't like, voices telling me how much I do love you, but telling me how much I want to love you. Important distinction. We have to realize we cannot love God on our own power. He has to give us the love, then we can love him back with it. That's what sanctity is. That's what grace is. Grace is God giving us the ability to love him properly. If we flatter ourselves and say, "Oh, I love God so much," and you're not loving God. God is giving you love, and you're loving him back with it. That's what has to happen, and she understood that. But with this vision of this crown of thorns, she said that afterwards Christ took off his crown and placed it on her head, and she said she felt her heart pierced at that moment. Now, it wasn't these mystical experiences that are proof of her sanctity, but it was the combination of a great interior life and a great practicality. That's where you really get the you would say you want to look for proof of sanctity, is because people who are very devoted in prayer and very mystical can oftentimes be very impractical or not good with other people, very short-tempered, very impatient. They just would rather be alone. Likewise, when you have somebody who's very, very practical and very good with people, oftentimes it's hard for them to spend time in prayer. They're very distracted and scattered. It's when you have the combination of both of those that is a great sign that somebody has mastered their temperament. And so for Veronica Giuliani, for 22 years, she governed as novice mistress, and afterwards 11 years as the abbess. So for 33 years, she lived in this convent and had these leadership positions, and she was very, very practical, and she was very kind to the other sisters. She had learned from her too harsh methods as a young girl, but retained her practical common sense. So as novice mistress, she would not allow novices to read mystical books, but had them read basic catechism. Don't fill their head with dreams, she would say, but with knowledge. As abbess, she was very orderly and disciplined, but she understood that grace builds on nature. She enlarged the convent to make spaces more comfortable for the nuns, and she had, this is in the 17th century, she had running water piped inside the convent for more practicality. At the same time, giving the nuns an example of her personal austerity and her prayer. So a wonderful combination there. So she had many more visions, but one of them was where Christ showed Saint Veronica on his heart, and on it were engraven in golden letters, Veronica of Jesus and Mary, which was her name. And Veronica later told one of her spiritual directors that the symbols of Christ's passion and the letters representing certain vows she had taken were etched on her own heart. Now, what that exactly meant, nobody would find until after her death. She died in 1727, 33 years after having that vision of being wounded by Christ with the crown of thorns. And after her death, they did an autopsy, and to the astonishment of the physician and the surgeon and other witnesses, the sacred symbols of a cross and some letters were engraven in the right ventricle of her heart. The letters were C for charity, O for obedience, F for fidelity, P for patience, and then U for humility, corresponding to those vows she had taken. So this is the life of St. Veronica Giuliani, and as I mentioned, very useful for us in seeing that the saints are not born saints. They have good tendencies in their childhood. She had a great example from her mother. She had a great kind of love for the poor as a child. She engaged in very pious practices, but she still had problems she had to overcome. She had that pride. She had that rigorism. She had that hardness of heart. What is our problem? Right? What is the one thing that we are not looking at? What is the one thing where we would rather not have to face that we would rather look at, I do this and I do that and I say my prayers and I want to give my life to God. Okay, what's the other side? Right? And the best way is, what do other people say about us? What would other people say my problem is? right? What have other people said my problem is, and listen to that and take it to heart and say, okay, that's where I need to change. That's where I need to accept the grace of God. Not where I'm already strong, but this one place where I'm weak and I don't want to accept the truth because it's a little bit painful. But accept it, right? Take after that example of St. Veronica Giuliani. You don't have to be giving your shoes away to the poor or setting aside food for the poor or having these mystical experiences. You need to follow that example that she did of accepting the truth, accepting when Christ showed her what was wrong. She had a heart of steel. She accepted it. And you can imagine her maybe a little bit of anger. That's not true. Look at how much I love the poor. Look at what I did for that poor beggar. Look at these things that I'm doing. How can you say I have a heart of steel? She was able to accept it, not in that way, but in this particular way. There's going to be a difference there. So I don't know what it is, but God knows what it is, and hopefully you know what it is. So think about that. Think about that one thing you need to change, that one fault that we have, and resolve, okay, that's where I'm going to work on. I'm going to accept the truth. I'm going to be humble. And then make that vow. Make that vow of obedience. You don't have superiors as laypersons, but we can all vow obedience to the circumstances of God. God orders all things sweetly to those who love him. So make a vow, right? This a promise, or resolution rather. I'm going to accept the things that come to me with a cheerful heart. No matter what happens, misfortune, calamity, I'm going to be cheerful. I'm going to accept this. I'm going to put myself under that obedience to God. Whatever he deigns to send me, I'm going to accept it. I will not reject it. That's the best way to set aside our own will and grow in that humility. That's what St. Veronica Giuliani did. We can do the same. Let's ask for her intercession. So God bless you all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.